Dean Rusk disagrees with you, and he was the Secretary of State at the time, but that's fine.
The communist nations have exploited the turmoil of a time of transition in an effort to extend communist control into other areas of the world.
Thoughts on Dean Rusk and America's involvement in Vietnam? I know next to nothing about that.
Exactly. The Stochastic Terror Lie. I, says the author, browsed the news recently only to discover that according to a popular science magazine, I, says the author, was responsible for the attempted murder of Paul Pelosi, husband to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. In an opinion piece for Scientific American, writer Byron Nelson insinuated that my factual reporting on Drag Queen Story Hour was an example of stochastic terrorism, which he defines as ideologically driven hate speech that increases the likelihood of unpredictable acts of violence. On the night of the attack, Nelson argued, I had appeared on Tucker Carlson's Tonight to discuss my reporting. And hours later, the alleged attacker, David DePape, radicalized by QAnon conspiracy theories about Democratic Satan-worshipping pedophiles, broke into the Pelosi residence and attacked Paul Pelosi with a hammer. This is a bizarre claim that, for a magazine supposedly dedicated to science, hardly meets a scientific standard of cause and effect. There is no evidence that DePape watched or was motivated by Tucker Carlson's program. Moreover, nothing in my reporting on Drag Queen Story Hour encourages violence or mentions Nancy Pelosi, QAnon, or Satan-worshipping people who hurt children. My appearance on Tucker Carlson Tonight and DePape's attack against Paul Pelosi are in reality two unrelated incidents in a large and complex universe, and Nelson, a microbiologist specializing in human excrement, is full of it. But Nelson isn't trying to prove anything in a scientific sense. Under the concept of stochastic terrorism, logic, evidence, and causality are irrelevant. Any incident of violence can be politicized and attributed to any ideological opponent, regardless of facts. The scheme works like this. Left-wing media activists and officials designate a subject of discourse, such as Drag Queen Story Hour, off limits. They treat any reporting on that subject as an expression of hate speech. And finally, if an incident of violence emerges that is related even tangentially to the subject, they assign guilt to the political opponents and call for the suppression of speech. The statistical concept of stochasticity, which means randomly determined, functions as a catch-all. The activists don't have to prove causality, they simply assert it with sophisticated turn of the phrase and a vague appeal to probability. Though framed in scientific terms, this gambit is a crude political weapon. In practice, left-wing media activists and officials apply the stochastic terrorism designation only in one direction: rightward. They never attribute fire bombings against pro-life pregnancy centers, arson attacks against Christian churches, or the attempted assassination of a Supreme Court justice to mere argumentation of left-wing activists, such as, say, opposition to the court's decision in Dobbs. See, in those cases, the left correctly adopts the principle that it is incitement rather than opinion that constitutes a crime, but conveniently forgets that standard as soon as the debate shifts to the movement's, and might I add the government's, conservative opponents. In recent years, the left has not only monopolized the concept of stochastic terrorism, whatever that's supposed to mean, but also built a growing apparatus for enforcing it. Last year, left-wing organizations and the Department of Justice collaborated on a campaign to suppress parents who opposed critical race theory under the false claim that sometimes heated school board protests were incidents of domestic terrorism. Earlier this year, left-wing activists and medical association called on social media companies and the Department of Justice to censor, investigate, and prosecute journalists who question the orthodoxy of radical gender theory. The obvious goal is to suppress speech and intimidate political opponents. Stochastic terrorism could serve as a magic term for summoning the power of the state. If this process is left unchecked, the consequences will be disastrous. Left-wing NGOs, social media companies, and federal security apparatchiks will gain unprecedented power to police speech and criminalize political opposition. Conservatives and old-line liberals who still care about civil liberties must expose the scheme and work to dismantle the apparatus that supports it. The line of argument is simple. Speech is not violence. Statistical abstraction is not a substitute for evidence, and free association fantasies cannot determine guilt. But the politics of fighting back are more complex. It will require dislodging a network of professionals who see the concept of stochastic terror as a path to power. That concept is built on a lie. It deserves to be exposed and discredited. Conservatives like Tucker Carlson, who passionately argue against the increasingly depraved policy agenda of the left, are terrorists, according to a trendy new definition of terrorism being pushed by leftists. The new definition may have support in the Biden-Harris regime. Scratch that, of course it does. The Disinformation Governance Board and the fact that the illegitimate regime coordinates with social media platforms to crush conservative thought, including opposition to vaccination mandates, ought to convince you of that. To leftist, conservative speech is inherently hateful and antisocial, and after floating around long enough, it eventually pushes somebody over the edge so they commit a heinous act, or so they have convinced themselves. 2 days after Peyton Gendron, a disturbed 18-year-old white male, allegedly shot and killed 10 people, May 14th, at a Tops Friendly Market in predominantly black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York, government-funded academic Kurt Braddock blamed the Fox News talk show host for the massacre. Since many articles out there gloss over what Gendron did, let's recount what we know. Gendron is now being processed by the criminal justice system. FBI Special Agent Christopher J. Dlugkinski swore out an affidavit on June 15th in support of the criminal complaint. Gendron's motive for the mass shooting was to prevent black people from replacing white people and eliminating the white race, and to inspire others to commit similar attacks, the FBI agent said. Gendron's rifle, recovered after the shooting, had various writings on it, including but not limited to names of others who have committed mass shootings, racial slurs, the statement, "Here's your reparations," and the phrase, "the great replacement," the FBI man stated. A search of his home recovered a handwritten note in which Gendron told his family he had to commit this attack because he cares for the future of the white race, the FBI agent added. Somehow, Tucker Carlson is to blame for all this because of things he said. In a blizzard of May tweets documented by Thomas Lifson at American Thinker, Braddock, an assistant professor of public communications in the School of Communication at American University, avoided saying what exactly Carlson supposedly did to provoke the attack. Instead, Braddock retreated into the pseudo-intellectual world of leftist academic jargon to smear the conservative polemicist without actually producing evidence to support his bold claim. Braddock accused Carlson of something he called stochastic terrorism, which he defined as a form of incitement where the speaker uses coded language, dog whistles, and other subtext to justify, promote, or advocate the use of violence without providing overt directives to do so. That would mean he didn't. He writes,
Whether the shooter was directly motivated by Carson is salient, but just as important is how he was normalized ideas that advocate violence, like what we saw in Buffalo. Braddock tweeted as he called for a debate about whether he and how stochastic terrorism is allowed to occur.
Displaying all the integrity and fidelity to facts of a Media Matters attack, dog, Braddock tweeted,
Literally just wrote a paragraph about far-right media motivating acts of terrorism by legitimizing conspiracy theories before I saw the news about hashtag Buffalo, I noted. Tucker Carlson's normalization of the great replacement bullshit. Carlson is a danger to the U.S. domestic security,
Braddock concluded. In other words, this academic thinks conservative ideas kill innocent people and something needs to be done. In reality, Carlson has never urged whites to harm blacks, and Braddock would be hard-pressed to explain how exactly Carlson normalized ideas that advocate violence like what we saw in Buffalo. The lack of a connection between words and evil deeds doesn't matter, because according to Braddock, Carlson, who in reality shares well-researched information and often nuanced, intelligent views with his audience, is on the wrong side of political issues such as immigration, wokeism, and multiculturalism in America, which, by the way, happens to be the least racist nation on earth. Braddock is clever. He readily admits that there is no direct causal link between Carlson's rhetoric and violent massacres, so he relies on hocus pocus to argue that the TV commentator's repeated comments over time somehow inspired violence. He accuses Carlson of deliberately using subtext to spur killers to action. Quote,
Stochastic terrorism is about the use of subtext to justify the use of violence,
Braddock tweeted on June 15th. The problem here is that interpreting subtext, as any literature student knows, is an inherently subjective activity. If a novelist writes that the curtains were blue, an English professor may say it reflects the melancholy of a character. But what if the novelist just decided, for other reasons, or for no reason in particular, to make the curtains blue? Subtext is in the eye of the beholder, but Braddock wants subtext to be enough to deem people to be terrorists. If Braddock wants to employ a weird kind of disparate impact-like analysis to Carlson, disingenuously blaming him for the murder of minorities because he inveighs against harmful policies enacted to benefit minorities, he is free to do so. Leftist politicians have been doing the same thing for decades, attempting to smear their enemies by saying that conservatives have sinister ulterior motives. Former Congressman Charles Rangel actually said that lowering taxes was racist. But Braddock's approach would squelch vitally important debates on the issues of the day. If Mexicans are illegally streaming across the border, speech identifying the problem is by definition stochastic terrorism, and possibly so-called hate speech. Because the theory goes it would lead to violence against Mexicans. And if Muslims are committing actual real-life terrorist attacks against America, speech pinpointing the problem is also stochastic terrorism that will necessarily result in violence against Muslims. Braddock is far from the only academic out there spewing dangerous, crazy ideas, but it's a problem that he is sponsored by the United States government. At a June 14th congressional hearing on the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Terrorism Prevention Grant Program, what is going on at the Department of Homeland Security, by the way? Braddock testified that he had taken in more than $550,000 from the DHS for research projects. Unsurprisingly, he has also called the former president a stochastic terrorist, the Epoch Times reported. The last president-hating turncoat, Elizabeth Noonan, was a senior DHS official. What is going on at the Department of Homeland Security? DHS official until early 2020 leveled the same bizarre accusations against the 45th president months after abandoning him. In a Washington Compost op-ed, Noonan wrote that the prior president was fomenting violence.
Language from campaign materials and Trump's extraneous speeches at rallies have been used as a justification for acts of violence and has repeatedly been confronted with this fact. He and his supporters retort that he has eventually denounced violence and white supremacists. But the issue is not whether he has ever condemned these ideas and people. No, it is that he is inconsistent and muddied in his condemnations. Extremists thrive on this mixed messaging, interpreting it as coded support.
Right. What does stochastic actually mean? To this word nerd, stochastic is an odd descriptor to apply to terrorism. Maybe its strangeness, its distance from common parlance, is why it was chosen. Merriam-Webster defines the word as meaning involving a random variable and involving chance or probability. That's not particularly satisfying, is it? Stochastic itself as a concept is difficult to master. According to the online etymology dictionary, in the 1660s it meant pertaining to conjecture, from Greek stochastikos, able to guess, conjecturing. Later it took on a more specific meaning, the sense of randomly determined. It's from 1934, from the German stochastic. According to Google English Dictionary provided by Oxford Languages, stochastic now means randomly determined, having a random probability distribution or pattern that may be analyzed statistically but may not be predicted precisely. If it can't be predicted, then isn't it? Okay, anyway. When stochastic is perpended to terrorism, something magical happens. Somehow the resultant phrase takes on the meaning of the public demonization of a person or group resulting in the incitement of a violent act which is statistically probable but whose specifics cannot be predicted, according to dictionary.com. Although there is evidence that the term dates back to at least 2002, the term stochastic terrorism, as we are using it here, spreads in the 2010s, probably credited to a blog post in 2011. Terrorism experts, security analysts, and political observers have been increasingly using the term stochastic terrorism in the late 2010s, especially in terms of how rhetoric from political and religious leaders inspires random extremists, typically young men considered to be radicalized by ISIS or white supremacist groups, the website states. We are no strangers, alas, to significant spikes in search of stochastic terrorism. The term trended up over 9,000% last October on dictionary.com amid discussion of news that bombs were being mailed to the Democratic leaders, according to the post dated on August 8, 2019. Obviously, it is an expression ready-made for attacks on anyone who refuses to toe a particular line. The term was apparently popularized by leftist Juliet Kayyem, an academic activist with a long Democrat pedigree. Kayyem was then President Barack Obama's Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. Previously, she was then Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's Homeland Security Advisor. Kayyem used the term in an inflammatory loose-with-the-facts screed in the Washington Compost titled, "There Are No Lone Wolves." According to her, then-President Donald Trump was to blame for the mass shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas on August 3, 2019, in which Patrick Wood's Cyrus's allegedly He is still being prosecuted, murdered 23 people. He allegedly said he was targeting Mexicans in the attack and wrote a manifesto saying the attack has come as a response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas. In a fit of fabulous fantasy, KM opines that the former president is to blame for the attack and other attacks against minorities because he
marks them as the other and is mimicked by white supremacists, whom he fails to shame. Trump's rhetoric winks and nods, curries favor, embraces both sides, and while not promoting violence specifically, certainly does not condemn it until after it occurs.
Trump has engaged in stochastic terrorism, which Karim says is, quote,
public speech that may incite violence, even without specific intent, has been given the name stochastic terrorism, for a pattern that can't be predicted precisely, but can be analyzed statistically. It is the demonization of groups through mass media and other propaganda that can result in a violent act because listeners interpret it as promoting targeted violent terrorism, and the language is vague enough that it leaves room for plausible deniability and outrage.
Trump, according to Karim, also fails to shame white supremacy. That is all anyone needs to know, and a responsible president, one who is appalled by the language, might have been misconstrued and was contributing to a great terror threat in America today, would surely change his rhetoric. Of course, listing all the things that the woke left wants conservatives to shame and apologize for would require writing a book. And Americans aren't even convinced that there is such a thing as white supremacy in America, a land where all minorities are free to live their lives as they please. In fact, minorities want to be in America so badly, they risk life and limb every day to get here. But this failure to shame a leftist hallucination is a grave thought crime in the eyes of woke betters as they devise new and improved ways to punish their enemies. Cam repeats the left's favorite lie about Trump, the one that insists evidence be damned that he praised violent white nationalists after an ill-fated Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. No matter how many times people of goodwill lay out the evidence, the Charlottesville lie will continue to live because leftists don't care about facts. This is hardly a revelation to conservatives, but now leftists seek to weaponize the absence of damning facts as proof of conservatives' bad ideas and intentions. Code words, dog whistles, and subtext are all that these people have.